Good morning and welcome everyone to Your Business Morning. Let's get Wednesday, the 10th of April started with what's making the headlines in the world of business and the markets. Good news for the Nigerian police as upper legislature passes a new police trust fund bill which is looking to improve police training, efficiency, recruitment, among other things. That was part of what the Senate did yesterday. The new police trust fund bill is heading now to President Buhari's office for consideration and executive signature. The bill has already been passed by the lower house of representatives. This is suspected to be a blue ocean for Nigeria's police, in particular the reform that is sorely needed in that arm of security. Meantime, the the Budget 2019 journey continues at the National Assembly. The Senate yesterday okayed all the key projections of the medium-term expenditure framework, what is called the MTEF, and the FSP, which is the fiscal strategy paper. The three-year document 2019-2021 got all the details passed by the upper legislative house, while the Senate President, Dr. Bukola Saraki, told his members, or the committee members, to meet the Thursday 11 deadline for submission of all reports, looking to meet the April 16 deadline set by the Senate to pass the 2019 appropriations. The Senate President says if the committee reports are not ready by Thursday, then the Senate may have no choice than to present the original document, which was placed before the Senate last year by Mr. President. So it's still looking at how to take care of the messy Apapa ports. The Nigerian Ports Authority says plans is now on our foot to start the automation of trucks call-up system, which will now happen in the month of August. They apologize for the delay in rolling out the call-up system, which is part of the plans to streamline the number of vehicles or articulated vehicles coming into Apapa port and ease congestion. And the biggest story on the street as we speak on economic terms is the IMF and World Bank spring meetings currently entering the third day in Washington, D.C. The World Economic Outlook report was out yesterday, and that's been causing quite a bit of upset. The IMF team of economists asked Nigeria to tighten its monetary and fiscal policies in the face of weakening oil prices, among other domestic and global headwinds. The new IMF World Economic Outlook projects Nigeria's GDP in 2019 will go higher to 2.5% from the forecast of 2.1% for 2018. That's the pardon there. 2.5% for 2020 from 2.1% in 2019. The IMF division chief in charge of research, Oya Selson, says we expect a Nigeria's growth recovery to continue, but the growth was reasonably strong last year, which was 2018. Nigeria did a 1.9% GDP. And the IMF, according to Oya Selson, think that things will improve a bit for Nigeria going forward. IMF Selson says Nigeria's 2019 growth forecast of 2.1% was because oil prices are going to be a bit weaker than we expected. Last time we did the forecast, that's according to the IMF. But let's take a listen about what the global framework or the factors that will impact oil prices outlook from the IMF will be in 2019 and 2020. Let's take a listen to a member of the research department, a member of the economics at the IMF who presented the presentation yesterday. Take a listen.
If we compare what we were forecasting in October to what we are forecasting now, we see that particularly for 2019, there is a sizable difference in the predictions for the oil price. In October, we were expecting, based on futures prices, oil prices to be about $70 a barrel. In 2019, they're over $10 lower now. And that, of course, implies a downward revision for oil exporters in general. Now, you have a bit two categories of oil exporters. You have some that are also suffering from a variety of other factors, including geopolitical tensions and strife. This is clearly not the case for the UAE, but we do have a downward revision, which is driven, as I said, by the lower oil price. It is about 1 percentage point, a bit less than 1 percentage point down the revision for 2019 and a little bit less for 2020. So the forecast is for growth to be just below 3% for 2019, just above 3% in 2020. But of course, again, oil price agreements to restrain oil production to support prices for 2019 and more generally weakening of global demand are the main factors at play.
Gian Maria Milesi Ferretti, a member of the Economic and Research Team at the International Monetary Fund in Washington, D.C. yesterday morning. But let's throw this a little bit, both the World Bank and the IMF. But this is where we're coming from. The IMF released Nigeria's Article 4 consultation reports last week. Then we got the World Bank over the weekend making some statements about Nigeria's economy and how the economy is slipping, as it were, slipping backwards, looking at some parameters showing Nigeria's economy is not in real growth between 1995 and 2018. Then yesterday, the IMF threw in another comment into what Nigeria should do in terms of tightening monetary and fiscal policies. So let's take all of this into get some insights and perspectives into it. Ayodeji Ebro is the Managing Director and Chief Executive Officer at Afrinvest Securities and is joining us live from our studios at the Nigerian Stock Exchange, downtown Lagos. Thank you very much, Ayodeji. It's good to have you on the program.
Yeah, good morning, Basin. Thanks for having me.
It's great to have you here. Thank you so much for your time. Let's hit the ground running. Let's start with some of the World Bank and IMF. One of the big story around is about GDP. GDP is one figure. Let's understand GDP and growth. What's the difference between the two? Let's break that understanding for people to understand.
Yes, when we talk about GDP, that's the aggregate output based on the services that and production that have been carried out in the country. But when you now look at it in terms of the growth, so we have what we call the real GDP and the nominal GDP. So in terms of the nominal GDP, does not factor in inflation, which the real GDP is deflated to reflect the increases in prices of goods and services. So for you to now have a growth, it means that on a real basis, your GDP is growing. It means when you decompose in terms of the GDP, you look at the private consumption element, which constitutes close to 60% in terms of contribution to GDP. You also want to look at the government, which is less than 10%, which is always the focus. And when you look at in terms of its impact, it's not as significant as you can see what private consumption is also doing. Then you have the investment angle before you also look at the imports and exports. So in terms of looking at GDP growth rate or in terms of how GDP can grow, so there need to be a lot of factors that needs to be in place. When you look at in terms of investment, the multiplier effect can be very significant if we invest significantly, both private and public investment. And what we have noticed as much as possible is that governments have tried to invest in infrastructure on its own. We look at, there's a report that says that within the next 30 years, we'll require about $30 trillion for us to be able to bridge that gap for infrastructure. For us to unlock the potential in the real sector, for the man on the street to feel the impact in terms of the policies, then there needs to be significant investment in infrastructure. The 1.6 trillion naira that government is assigning for capital expenditure cannot do that for us. And because when you look at in terms of the population growth growing at about 2.6%, that will not do that for us. There needs to be a significant partnership with private investors that would be willing to fund some of this infrastructure. But unfortunately, we've not seen any major interest from that angle, and that should be a major concern for the government.
Yes, Ayodeji, just a second, may I respectfully cut in here very quickly. Still understanding GDP and forecast. If you take this into the private sector, your GDP is like the size of your balance sheet, isn't it? So what would people really want to know? What matters really? Is it the size of the GDP, or the size of your growth? What really matters? Is it whether you have 100 billion naira balance sheet, 300 billion balance sheet, you have a 1 billion balance sheet? What's different does it make? The size of your GDP and the size of your growth in terms of percentage terms?
Yes, you know, when we talk about inclusive growth, so the economy can be growing but may not be inclusive. And when we talk about inclusiveness, it means that there's level playing ground for every Nigerian. In terms of your ideas, you're able to implement. In terms of your business, you're able to set up and you're able to run and effectively. And in terms of fairness or equity, that is also very key to for you to have inclusiveness in your growth. So what we've been seeing is that, yes, Nigeria may have been growing, GDP may be expanding, but when you look at the major, how has the man on the street, how have they been able to feel the impact when there's unavailability of infrastructure, power, it's not there in terms of security. So when you look at some of all these factors that should engender growth for individual or even for the economy, those factors are absent. So even if we try to look away from even the growth numbers, which is still lagging behind the population growth rates, you will discover that the growth that we've also been having has not been very inclusive. So we've not, the average Nigerian has not been feeling much of the impact. To set up your business today, you need to provide your power. You would be forced to also even provide your infrastructure for you to be able to have access to the goods or the services that you want to provide. So most of these things are significant burden on the average Nigerian, such that most of the businesses, when you look at it in terms of the visibility of most of those businesses, they are out of the money. They are not sustainable. And if they are not increasing in terms of creating more businesses, then there can be employment. And you can see that even the unemployment figures too have also been increasing on a year-on-year or a quarter-on-quarter basis. So these are major concerns, major problems that government itself cannot solve alone. I think it's more about looking at the policy that will attract private investment to assist the government, such that the capital expenditure part of the spending that government is putting on the table to push, to support GDP, government can be using that as equity contribution, and you will see more multiplier effect than just trying to fund all the projects. Look at the petroleum space. They've been looking for, government is trying to attract investors into that space, but because of some of the past antecedents of how contracts have been cancelled, most of those are not telling well to foreign investors, and as a result, we are not seeing as much interest that we should be seeing in terms of investment into infrastructure or even the power sector.
Okay, so that brings us to what you call investments. You need to grow, but you need investments. Even the United States still needs investment, including China. So all about make America great again, and all that is about bringing jobs back, bringing industries and everybody back to the U.S., create jobs on homeland America and all of that. So we also need investments, both local and foreign here, and if you don't have this money, things are going to be tough. So how do we grow this economy via the various investment windows, whether portfolio or direct?
No, I think the focus should even be more on direct investment. You would see the foreign direct investment into Nigeria has dropped from a high of about $9 billion in 2011 and to about $2 billion last year. And when you look at, if you even dissect the $2 billion, it may just be as a result of 5 or 6 transactions. And so that brings up the problem, why are we not seeing foreign direct investment? There are a lot of public-private partnerships that we ought to have been seen in Nigeria, but you will look at some of the few PPP arrangements that we've had in the past. for most of them, government has not kept their own side of the deal. Or for most of them, they've even cancelled or reversed the transaction. And as a result, most foreign direct investors, they try to limit any investment that they will do within the period of that particular government. So if there's any investment that would require 10 years, which will require about 10-year payback period, they will not be willing to invest in it because a new government may come and may reverse all those transactions. So what I think government should focus more on is should review some of these policies that will attract foreign portfolio investment, foreign direct investment, foreign direct investment. And if we are able to do that such that you can enforce contracts, the process of signing those contracts can be made more rigorous such that people, in terms of taking into account the fairness in terms of the citizenry before those contracts are signed, if they take that into consideration, then no government can come and just reverse such transactions. So if we are sure that once you sign, it's well reviewed, then you would see that government will not even be bothered in terms of trying to finance infrastructure. You look at the power sector, the banks that supported the privatization of the power sector, based on their projection, you look at the MITO has not been reviewed, and based on the current tariff, which is not cost reflective, most of the GENCOs or the DISCOs cannot pay back. So if we are even looking at domestic investment, the banks that should also be supporting that got their hand burnt when they supported the power sector privatization.
Okay.
So
Ayo.
you can see the major factor, a major reason why that has been lacking.
Okay, Ayo, a quick one, and let's end the discussion on this particular front in terms of, so look, Nigerians, we don't seem to like the IMF here, and that's quite historic. So anytime the IMF or the World Bank talk about Nigeria, we seem not to listen. Whatever it is, we don't seem to like them. So, well, that's a discussion for another day. But we have our own projections and forecasts, isn't it? We have a GDP forecast under the ERGP. We have our own forecast as to where inflation will be and all of that. So if we tell the folks in Washington, the Bretton Woods institutions, and say, look, thank you very much, we'll mind our own business here. How do you think we are on track to meet our own projections? This is part of what the IMF, Oya Selson, says yesterday. She said, we expect Nigeria to be on a growth recovery. Growth was reasonably strong last year, 1.9%, and we think that things will improve a bit going forward. Use their words, things will improve a bit going forward.
Yes, I think what the IMF and the research analysts have looked at is this is still the same government, and they've looked at and studied how, in terms of implementation of policy, went in the last 4 years. So for these 4 years that we're all looking forward to, depending on the rate of implementation, there are very interesting policies that have been set. The EGRP is also there. But how do we, in terms of the rate of implementation, if we actually implement most of the policies that have been set up in terms of strategies and ideas, in funding infrastructure, in funding the power, the PIB bill, then I think Nigeria is on track, and would be able to achieve that projection. We may even surpass it if we see dedication and we are focused in terms of implementation of some of these policies.
Thank you so much. We appreciate your time coming through this morning to talk us through some of the current World Bank, IMF stories or headlines in the news box. Thank you very much. Have a great trading day. The Chief Executive Officer at Securities. Thank you so much. That's live from our studios at the Nigerian Stock Exchange. The conversation around the infrastructure window and investment continues after the break. We're back in 2 minutes. You're watching Business Morning.